Now, it is my pleasure to introduce our moderator and guest speaker. J.B. Pritzker is an entrepreneur, investor, and philanthropist. His business interests are varied, but perhaps most notable are his dedication and passion for building a robust technology sector in the Midwest. JB has played an essential role in the creation of many startups here in Chicago. He is co-founder and managing partner of the Pritzker Group, a private investment firm with offices in Chicago and Los Angeles. Pritzker Group comprises 3 professional investment teams: middle market acquisitions, technology venture capital, and asset management. JB is an active civic leader and engaged board member of a number of cultural, educational, and business organizations. He is currently the first vice chairman of the Economic Club of Chicago, and as Chicago Magazine has dubbed him, the other mayor of Chicago. Welcome, JB. General Hayden is a retired 4-star general who has dedicated his entire life to serving the United States. He was the country's first principal deputy director of national intelligence, which is the highest-ranking intelligence office in the armed forces. General Hayden served in numerous other high-ranking positions throughout his career and has always been on the forefront of national intelligence. He is the only American to have led both the Central Intelligence Agency and the National Security Agency. Today, General Hayden is the principal of the Chertoff Group, a global security advisory firm that provides consulting, business development, and merger acquisition advisory services for clients in the security, defense, and government service industries. His extensive background in intelligence and broad geographic and political knowledge provides the basis for his work briefing clients on matters worldwide, including the risks associated with political, economic, and security situations. General Hayden is widely respected for his wisdom and is known as a straight shooter to the public, well, as much as you can be with intelligence matters. We are very, very honored to have him here with us today. Please join me in welcoming General Hayden.
Well, good afternoon. Thank you for that very, very kind and very generous welcome. A lot of my life lived in Washington. I like to comment after introductions like that, clearly not given under oath. All right. So I was wondering, what could we talk about here today? Okay, you got Syria, Ukraine, Iran, China, those islands out in the East China. That airplane thing keeps coming back. But I'd already decided that rather than trying to hit upon specific points, and we'll get to some specific points in the Q&A, there are a lot of things happening beneath the surface. And I'm going to use a physical metaphor here. There are tectonic plates moving, and these tectonic plates are causing an awful lot of disturbances on the surface of the Earth, and we're seeing those disturbances. But it might be more useful to spend the 20, 25 minutes I have here to transmit talking a little bit about the tectonics. What's causing the Earth and the ocean to move in such violent ways? So here goes. I've got 3 or 4 general principles, and then we'll get to some specifics. The first tectonic I'd suggest to you is the things that can hurt us are different than the things that used to be able to hurt us. Let me explain that. If I say Brent Scowcroft, do you all recognize that name? National Security Advisor not once, but twice, right? President Ford, President Bush, 41, clearly one of America's greatest strategic thinkers. Brent wrote an article about 18 months ago, maybe a little longer, for the Atlantic Council. And I read it and I said, boy, this is really insightful. And I went to talk with him because I worked for him on the NSC staff of 41. And what I'm going to tell you now are kind of my words, but I think reflect General Scowcroft's thoughts based on the article and my conversation. Here goes. He said, when I was doing my thing, practically all the pieces on the board I cared about were nation states. And the way I moved the pieces around the board was through something that you and I now call hard power. Those of you not familiar with that kind of Washington term, hard power, masses of men and metal at the right place at the right time. Or if we didn't like you, the threat of masses of men and metal. Or if we did like you, the promise of masses and men and metal. And Brent's point was neither of those two sentences, what I care about, the pieces that are important to nation states, and I move them around through hard power, neither of those sentences are anywhere near as true today as they were when he was National Security Advisor. If you think back, Brent was National Security Advisor at the height, forward, and the back end, 41, of the industrial age. And Brent points out in his article that practically everything in the industrial age seemed to strengthen the nation state. I mean, it required nation-state structure to get big things done. Communism, horrible theory of government, worst theory of history, not a bad system if you want to rapidly industrialize. The Republican Party, known today from way back when as an anti-slavery party, but it actually had two pillars in its platform: anti-slavery and the construction of necessary infrastructure here in the United States. All those land grants to railroads coming from here, heading out west, all the product of a central government trying to create big things. I'm old, I'm looking around, there are probably a few people out there with similar age. I'm old enough to remember them when making a phone call was such a difficult undertaking that we entrusted it only to a government or a government-run monopoly, remember? And nowadays, the last thing you want to think of when I'm done talking and you grab your iPhone is to think that the success of this next phone call depends on the guys who did that website. Okay. Brent's point is that as the industrial age strengthened government, the post-industrial information age weakens government. It subtracts from government power. Now, this isn't absolute, but there's relative truth here. We have pushed power down from large, complex organizations like states down to sub-state actors, even down to the level of individuals. And for the most part, that's a great thing. Again, I'm old enough to remember that I used to have to get in a car, drive to a building, and talk to a human being to get my money. And I don't know the last time I ever did that. I mean, we're empowered to do that on our own now. But the power that's been pushed down to individuals for good has been pushed down to individuals and sub-state actors and small groups for evil. And these groups are far more empowered to harm us than they used to be. Again, I'm old enough to remember when I didn't lose any sleep over a religious fanatic living in a cave in the Hindu Kush. But we all have. Okay? So the vector of threat coming at us is no longer just, or maybe even primarily, the product of nation-state power. The vector of threat coming at us day in and day out more often is the product of nation-state weakness or nation-state failure. It's coming at us because there are failed states in ungoverned areas. Whether it's terrorism or cybercrime or transnational crime, it's the weakness of states. Now, here's the problem. We hardwired our system to defend us right after World War II. We hardwired it in the National Security Act of 1947. National Security Act of 47 created the National Security Council, the Central Intelligence Agency, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Department of Defense, and America's Air Force. We are hardwired to deal with threats that emanate from nation states. And today, the threats are coming at us, by and large, not this way, but this way. And so let me take a couple of very prickly issues that have kind of raised their head in the last 10, 15 years and tie them to this reality. We're at war with al-Qaeda. Okay, al-Qaeda is a danger. Al-Qaeda has caused catastrophic damage similar to what we used to associate with nation states. The largest, most successful attack on the American homeland in history, for example. So we're at war with al-Qaeda. Okay, good. Kill the enemy. That's what you do with nation states. That's generally accepted. We're all in agreement. What's that look like when we bend that structure over to deal with this threat? It looks like drones. It looks like targeted killings outside of internationally agreed theaters of conflict. Okay? You're at war. Capture the enemy. How long do you keep them? For the duration of the conflict. What's that look like today? Looks like a small camp on the southeast corner of Cuba. Guantanamo. You're at war. Intercept the enemy's communications. You know, Bletchley Park, Enigma, Purple, Battle of Midway. What's it look like in this war? It looks like everything Edward Snowden's told you about for the last 9 months. Do you see the issue? So issue number one is that things that can really hurt us are of a different character than the things that used to be able to really hurt us. And we're in the middle of a massive adjustment as to how we now defend ourselves against this new flavor of threat. That's the first tectonic. Now, obviously, that's very much related to technology. Not just technology, but very much related to technology. But technology itself would be the second tectonic that I'd want to suggest to you. And I don't mean incremental technology, you know, the kind that was exemplified by manned flight or moving from propeller-driven aircraft to jet aircraft, or even moving into space. I mean, those are all big deals. But those were kind of on a continuum, you know what I mean? You know, a little farther, further, faster sort of thing. Technology in the last 20, 25 years has been incredibly disruptive. And here I'm talking about the global interconnectedness that we have created in the World Wide Web in the cyber domain. Now, there's an interesting word, domain. Let me tell you, well, I was at an event. Actually, it was like this, with really bright lights, and I couldn't see the audience. But I was in Las Vegas, okay? And I was in a big room, a ballroom at Caesar's Palace with 3,500 members of an organization called Black Hat, kind of semi-reformed hackers, okay? And I'm saying, you know, I think this cyber thing's catching on, all right? And they laughed. And I said, yeah, but you laugh, but I don't think you recognize how big a deal it is. You just kind of take it for granted. You know, you check your email, you see the missed calls, you do the voicemail, you do a little web crawling, some surfing. You don't realize how disruptive this is. And at that point in Las Vegas, I played my own Ed McMahon to my own Johnny Carson and said, how disruptive is it, Johnny? And I said, this is about, and I'm a history major, by the way, okay? I'm not a technologist. But as a history major, I think this is about as disruptive as the European discovery of the Western Hemisphere. And you think back to your either American history courses or your Western Civ courses, you know, that was kind of a big deal. That changed all sorts of concepts. Concepts of government, it's the beginning of the European empires. Concept of what constitutes humanity. Different patterns of trade, new goods that we never knew existed, people we never knew existed, diseases we never knew existed, all become commingled and created an explosion of human contact and creativity that dwarfed practically anything that we've ever seen before. So I thought that was pretty good, you know, and I did a lot of other things in the speech, and I'm walking out of the ballroom, and very unusual for Black Hat, a guy about my age comes up next to me. And he says, nice speech, Hayden. Well, thank you, sir. He said, but you lowballed the change thing. He said, your description had it changing the external world. This is changing the internal world. This is actually changing human cognition. Okay, interesting theory. You know, intuitively, that seemed to have a lot of truth. I was in Aspen last October. Charlie Rose was doing a conference and different panels, and one panel was the greatest brain people in the world. I mean, people who understood human thought and how the brain connected to human thought. So I walked up to them afterwards and kind of cornered them after the presentation and said, you know, I was in Las Vegas a couple of years ago, and I walked them through the whole story. I said, is that true? And they said, well, it will not change the structure in the brain. That's biological, that's coded. But it will change how the brain's elements connect to one another. So the answer is, yeah, it's true. And those of you who have children or grandchildren know it's true. They actually think about these things differently. So this is a really big deal. It's so big a deal that your armed forces now consider this cyber thing a domain. Look up here, let me describe for you. Here's the way GIs think about it. Land, sea, air, space, cyber. We actually think of it now as a location. You know, it's well, the only good word in English for it that really kind of captures it is the one I used earlier. It's a domain. And now with this, remember back to tectonics? okay? We're trying to figure out what of our experience down here, land, sea, air, and space, works up here, okay? Like, do the laws of armed conflict down here work in the same way up here? Like, reasonable expectations of privacy down here, do they work the same up here? How about sovereignty? Does the theory of sovereignty we've developed with vital episodes, certainly, over the last thousands of years, do theories of sovereignty down here work the same way up here? Let me give you a question I shared with a group out in Palo Alto at Stanford 2 days ago, Sunday night. Does a server in Germany, which is obviously part of this world up here, right, which lacks geography, right? Does a server in Germany enjoy as much German sovereignty in terms of protection as the building in which that server is located? And the answer is, we're not sure. And so another of the big tectonics out there is that we're up here in a really big place that's really affecting everything. And it's speeding ahead with massive technological advances, most of which are wonderful. And we haven't yet figured it out. Let me give you one final example. Because, by the way, sometimes down here, trust me, introduced as a former director of CIA, sometimes down here we ain't figured it out so well either. Okay? Things get a little prickly here as to, well, you did what? Okay? All right? I travel with a backpack, and I gotta go out to ORD here almost as soon as we're done. But let's assume I go up to the room and grab my backpack, and I go out in front here, and I'm on Michigan Avenue, and one of your finest pulls up in a car, right? And says, "Open the bag." Now, like most of you, I would probably respond with a 2-word monosyllabic Old English phrase that translates roughly to, "Oh, I think not." But if I got in the car and went out to O'Hare, and the young kid at the TSA line said, "Sir, open your bag," what does everyone in this room do? You open the bag. I mean, my point is, we've kind of worked it out down here. We have not yet really worked out really fundamental issues up here. So that's the second tectonic. The third tectonic, again, these are all related. It's kind of hard to separate them. But the third tectonic is kind of cultural. And let me cut to the chase. So I'm the director of CIA, and I've got an advisory board, actually comprised of, like many of the folks in this room, prominent Americans, not from the intelligence disciplines. I need an over-the-shoulder to make sure we're doing things consistent with American values and so on. One of the members of my board was Carly Fiorina. We don't usually mention the names. She's given me permission. It's not secret, it's just private. So I had subcommittees on the board. And here's the question. I had one that, hey, how's our information technology? How are we doing there? The other one was, how are we doing recruiting? The third was, Carly, here's the heavy lift question. Get a subcommittee from the board and answer me this. Will America be able to conduct espionage in the future inside a political culture that every day demands more transparency and more public accountability from every aspect of national life? And they went away and went to the mountaintop and thought thoughts and talked to people. And 3 or 4 months later, they came back. They're in that conference room. I walk across the hall on the 7th floor out at Langley. I sit down. It's Condi and her subcommittees. And I say, okay, Carly, so will America be able to conduct espionage inside a broader political culture that every day demands more transparency and more public accountability from every aspect of national life? And she looked me right in the eye and said, we're not sure. Which frankly is a very good answer and a very compelling answer. The line between what it is we allow our government to do without our knowledge and what it is we demand to know is moving very rapidly, and that's all part of the swirl of trust in government and so on, all right? But now you've got the Snowden revelations that are kind of feeding this beast with one headline about every 10 days now. It slowed down a bit, but that was the pace for a while. I mean, what does our culture want the security services to do? And what will our culture permit our security services to do. Those are moving lines right now. If I say the 215 program, that's the metadata thing. That's, they got all your phone bills in a room up at Fort Meade. There are a lot of details about that, but just, okay, they got all your phone bills. That program, the 215 program, has been legislated by Congress, passed by bipartisan majorities in both houses, okay, and been reauthorized on multiple occasions. It has been authorized by 2 presidents, and I might add 2 incredibly different presidents in their personalities and global outlook. And it's overseen by the federal court system in terms of the FISA court. Okay? Congress, the president, the courts. That is the Madisonian trifecta. Okay? That is as good as it gets in our former concept of consent of the governed. The objection now from a significant fraction of American society is, yeah, but you didn't tell me. And there is a growing body of thought, which is not, I'm not saying it's illegitimate, I'm just saying it's different. There's a growing body of thought that what you just did there, which is kind of like representative government, that's the consent of the governors. It's not consent of the governed. And that's the street fight we're going to have, not whether they can keep your metadata, your phone bills, not whether they can keep your metadata 18 months or 24 months. And yeah, we'll argue about that, and it'll look ugly. But fundamentally, it's this relationship of the individual to his or her government that is now shifting and causing all those perturbations up here on the surface. There's one more tectonic I want to give you. It's a little bit different in kind than the other 3, which are incredibly fundamental. This tectonic just has to do, remember Brent said all the pieces on the board I cared about were nation states? And, all right. There is an erosion of the nation state. I got that. That's kind of point 1. Point 4 here is that the shape of nation states, the shape is changing. States are going away. Things that we took as givens, all right? That, that's a country, France. It's been there. It'll be there tomorrow. It'll be there for a long time. A lot of states are going away. And the ones that are going away are pretty much all the products of that 5 to 10 year period after World War I. These are all the states that were created or caused to have been created by the Versailles Treaty. Let me walk you through memory lane here. Y'all remember Czechoslovakia? Okay, that doesn't exist anymore. Yugoslavia doesn't exist anymore. The Soviet Union wasn't a product of Versailles, but it occurred, kind of as a byproduct of the First World War and the Versailles Treaty. The Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore. It's broken up into 15 republics. I might add that this whole Ukraine thing that we're looking at now, and the Crimea and so on, is kind of like correcting all the rounding errors of the dissolution of a post-Versailles state, that the internal lines weren't quite drawn according to ethnic, religious, or historical reality. And now we're, by the way, there's no way an apologia for what Putin's doing. I'm just trying to describe for you that it's just not Putin. I don't need a demon here to have this problem. This problem is existing because of the tectonic underneath it. That's, the lines are going away. So what are the new lines? And now it's game on. So if you think that's troubling for Europe, hop across the Med. Okay? Take a look at the Eastern Mediterranean. Take a look at the Levant. Remember that weekend we thought we were going to go bomb Syria? Remember that last August? Yeah. I was all lined up to be on Meet the Press, okay, with David Gregory. I think Barry McCaffrey was going to be there with me. Barry's a retired Army 4-star. And since we were going to go to war, you're going to have kind of an operator guy and an intel guy, and, we'd be talking. Well, we didn't go to war. I got canceled. I was never on. Remember the speech Secretary Kerry gave that Friday? Greg has met my wife Janine. We lived in our house in McLean for about 5 years and said, hey, time to clean the windows. Right, first time, clean the windows in 5 years. So we're going from room to room. It's taken 2 days, and I'm not going to work. And I said to Janine, I got to watch Secretary Kerry's speech. So we got to be in a room with a widescreen, clean the windows. So when this is on. So we watch the speech, and we're cleaning, and she gets all done. She says, "Oh, what'd you think?" I said, "Well, I really wish I went downtown today." Why? I think there's been a coup. I mean, that was a presidential speech. I mean, it was buckle up, we're going to war speech. Then that night, the president takes a long walk on the South Lawn with Dennis McDonough. He says, not so much. And Saturday morning, he gives, we're all anticipating, I have ordered the American Armed Forces. And, nope. He says, I'm going to kick it to Congress. They'll make a decision. So when I thought I was going to go and meet the press, they don't give you much rehearsal. I mean, they don't give you any rehearsal, and barely do they even let you know what's going on. But we did know that David Gregory was going to say, well, generals, let's go to the map. And we were going to go walk to this big map of the Eastern Mediterranean. And I'd already rehearsed in my mind my first sentence for that, which never happened, which was, well, David, do you see that map? Don't get used to it. That map, which they would have shown you, comprises at least 3, maybe 4 artificial countries. Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and a little bit to the west, Libya, were created for the convenience of European diplomats. They do not reflect reality on the ground, historic, cultural, ethnic, or religious reality. They are artificial states. They have been flash frozen and have seemed permanent to your eye and mine because of raw power. The first element of raw power attached to it was the European empires. And when they were gone, it was the Cold War. And then when the Cold War was over, it was Arab autocrats. And now you've all seen, referred to tectonics 1, 2, and 3, you've all seen what's happening to Arab autocrats. And now all those passions that have been bottled up inside those states because they were artificial and the cork kept on the bottle because of raw power, the cork's off. And now you're seeing this explosion of violence as things that maybe could have, would have, should have been allowed to be resolved over the course of a century with far less violence now get unleashed all at once. And so the tectonic here is, Bashar al-Assad's a bad guy, and Hezbollah shouldn't be helping him, and the Iranians shouldn't be offering assistance, and the Sunnis in Saudi Arabia and Jordan and Qatar, maybe they shouldn't be throwing fuel on this fire. But this area is going to burn, and it's going to burn because of that tectonic, not because of a decision made in that capital or this capital. I mean, they can dampen the fires, but fundamentally, the cause of this is long-term and structural, and fundamentally, you're going to be worried in your business and in your personal life about the stability of that part of the world for the next 10 to 20 years. It has to be that way, again, because of what's happening below the surface. So those are the tectonics, all right? The state structure is being reallocated. Technology has created an entirely new domain. Our political culture is giving us new ground rules, and the things that could do us harm are a bit different than our historical experience and the structures we have built to defend ourselves against them. And with that, I'm almost on time and be happy to take questions as they come up. Thank you very much.
Terrific. Well, General, I'm frightened by about half of everything you said. But I thought, rather than delve into some of the topics that you raised, I've got to go with one you really didn't talk about because it's on the minds, I think, of everybody in the room. We'll get it out of the way. But it's all over the news. And it's the question, what happened to that airplane?
I've got 2 or 3 responses. How the hell should I know? Did I say that, or did I just think that? Okay, so now, who does the crime benefit? Putin did it
Perfect.
to distract us. And I must admit, that's got to be the luckiest dictator on the planet, having our 7x24s absolutely consumed by this, while he's actually changing those borders in Europe. The third thing I'd add is, you know, some things in life are secret, and you pay a lot of good people to go ahead and either steal those secrets, all right, or to build a case based upon data points that gives you an hypothesis that makes a judgment more rather than less likely. Other things in life are a mystery. And we need to be prepared that this one may end up a mystery and that we really don't know at the end of the day. If you're asking me my opinion, Occam's razor, simplest explanation is usually the best. It crashed.
Okay, but I think everybody in the room would say that we think the intelligence infrastructure is so good that it must have been spotted by somebody. It must have been tracked by somebody. I would raise to you the question that if an airliner went off the grid coming toward the United States as it was there going toward China, I'm guessing, you tell me, that we would have some way of finding it and knowing where it ended up. If you tell me otherwise, I'm going to be even more frightened.
Yeah. So let me get this right. I'm out here in the heartland hearing an argument that your intelligence services really just aren't collecting enough stuff. Okay. The answer is no, and what you get from the hyperventilating press coverage is that an organization like NSA is omniscient and looks at everything. It's just simply not true. I actually did press NSA for a number, and they say on any given workday, they may touch, and I mean some of this could be an incredibly light touch, about 1.5% of global internet traffic. All right? Now, multiply 1.5% by the number that constitutes global internet traffic, that's a big number. But so is 98.5%. And this was you posited a circumstance if it were flying towards the United States, yeah, I think we'd have a lot more data points. But it apparently made that left turn just prior to hitting Chinese air defense identification zone kinds of activities, and kind of went into that space where we don't know.
So is that to imply that the Chinese have less sophisticated systems than the United States?
Yeah, no, they do. But if it had continued on, the Chinese systems are sufficient that we would know a lot more than we do.
All right, let's turn to Ukraine. Secretary Clinton, former Secretary Clinton, made a remark that was repeated in the press quite a lot that suggested that Russia's actions in Crimea have some echoes, or are some echoes, of Germany's actions in the 1930s when the Nazis claimed that they had to protect German minorities in Eastern Europe, and that was their excuse for going in. Do you think that's an accurate?
Yeah. It's accurate as far as it goes, but frankly, it proves too much. All right? I mean, there are parallels between Hitler stirring up the Germans who were not being mistreated by the Czechoslovakian government at all, but creating a cause for an intervention and then a seizure of the Sudetenland. All right? And you see that repeated with regard to what Putin's doing. So there the parallels go. They're fine. But then the implication is the parallels over here keep on going. You had an aggressive, non-status quo power, very desirous of disrupting the status quo in Europe and globally, and a rising power. None of those sentences are true for this guy. All right? Russia's a bit of a declining power, and despite the thumping of his chest and his country's chest and what they've done in these very local circumstances, one explanation for why he has been so aggressive, that other than restoring Russian pride, he's got nothing else to show for his time in government. I mean, Russia's running out of most things most states need to be successful, like democracy and entrepreneurship, and they're running out of oil, they're running out of gas. I mean, this place is like Saudi Arabia with a bad winter. I mean, it is an extraction economy. It's not a modern economy. And most importantly, they're running out of Russians. I mean, the birth rate is nosed over significantly. So other than restoring Russian pride, what can he do? So now he's in a prison of his own making in Sochi. All right? Things are going to hell in Kiev. His guy is going under and badly handling the situation. He can't leave Sochi. He can't show a Russian hand, an overt Russian hand, in dealing with what's going on in Kiev. He has to wait until it's all over. Now he flies back to Moscow. He has suffered an incredible humiliation. I don't think that we appreciate that enough. He has suffered an incredible humiliation in the part of his portfolio, which is the only part where he's got check marks. And therefore, this is probably more about Russian domestic politics and Putin sustaining his image than it is about the Crimea.
All right, so this is all sort of interesting discussion if, in fact, it stops at Crimea. But as you know, there's this discussion about, he's got to stop the unrest against, as my question indicated, the unrest that may lead to violence against Russians who are in Ukraine. So if he takes the next step, can you tell me what you think the United States or Europe's response needs to be?
Yeah. I mean, Crimea is a severable issue here, right? Crimea is special. I mean, he does have some legitimacy in terms of the claim to the Crimea. Back to my tectonic plates and the lines moved and so on. I mean, Crimea was Russian it's been Russian forever, until 1954, and Khrushchev handed it to the Ukrainians. The population, by and large, is Russian, and it's just not Russian. It's made up largely of Russian military retirees. It's kind of like Tampa, okay? So his behavior is horrific. There are strong measures we should take, but it's fundamentally different from that first Russian armored vehicle that crosses the eastern border of Ukraine proper and goes into that good black earth there of the eastern Ukraine. Then it's Katie bar the door. Then all those Sudetenland metaphors and analogies, they start to get a lot more legitimacy. Because with the Crimea, there's a natural break. It was, you've done that, it's bad, but it's not this. Once he goes into eastern Ukraine, what's the natural break? Anywhere Russians live? I mean, they'd be going after Brighton Beach next.
And so what should our response be?
Okay, response. Yeah. First of all, we let him out of the penalty box far too quickly after a similar action in Georgia. All right, I mean, this is just very powerfully parallel. And we went back to the reset thing and frankly forgave them for Georgia. And so there are concrete steps we could take. Number one, a broad, general, Western-agreed policy of isolation. You wanted to be included in the family of nations. The family of nations have certain standards. You're not meeting up to them. You don't get the keys to the car anymore. You don't, okay? You really are punished. And that's G8 and WTO and G20 and so on. Second, the most important thing we can do is to actually create a government in the Ukraine. All right? This is a vacuum right now. And a lot of elements of the Ukraine, the Russian population, the Ukrainian so-called government, the Russian population has legitimate reason to fear some very severe right-wing groups. So true civil society in the Ukraine needs to be constructed. And I think the punishments for the Russians for what they're doing have to be broad and substantial, not that we've got a list of 10, 12 people that, would lose their money if they had it in U.S. banks and can't go to Disney World. Not enough.
Okay, so if he invades Ukraine, we send him to his room.
Very much so.
Okay.
Yes. For a long time.
Okay, I want to turn to cybersecurity. This, I think, has affected everybody in the room in some fashion or another. It certainly has affected our national government infrastructure, defense infrastructure. So can you talk about what do you see today as our weakest links? What are the greatest threats that are against us today? Yeah. And are we even close to addressing them?
Yeah. So remember my hand puppet up here, land, sea, air, space, cyber. We haven't figured out the rules. That meeting in Vegas. I leaned into the darkness to the black hat guys and said, I know who made these. I'm pretty sure who made this one too. And you messed it up. And if you look at the history of the cyber domain, it was not built to be secure. It was not built to be defended. I mean, it was built on implicit trust. No one who put the architecture together thought it would end up where it is today. All right? And so, number one, all advantage in that domain goes to the offense. Trust me, I ran NSA for 6 years. We played offense in the cyber domain. It's not hard. All right? So it is inherently difficult to defend. That's one reality. Second reality, because of that political cultural tectonic that I mentioned, our government is late to need defending us up here, and will be forever late to need defending us up here because of our civil liberties concerns. Number three, and this is the good news, as happens most often when our government doesn't meet need, the private sector steps in. And there's incredible private sector activity up here to create cyber defense in terms of reducing your vulnerability, in terms of helping you manage the consequences of an attack, in terms of threat intelligence, so that you know who's coming after you, for what purpose, with what tools. And so, in essence, the next sound you're going to hear is not a digital bugle from the digital cavalry coming over the ridgeline to save you. The government is going to find, and I'm a creature of government for 4 decades, but the government is going to find it very hard to be really effective up here for the reasons I've mentioned. So it's the private sector that really has to step in. Greatest danger right now is people just stealing your stuff. It's just cyber theft. We've seen other examples of people using a cyber weapon to actually deny you your network. Remember the DDoS attacks, distributed denial of service attacks against the big banks, almost certainly being done by the Iranians. Bank of America, JP Morgan Chase, Wells Fargo, massive DDoS attacks that prevented you and me from checking our accounts or moving money around. So now you have that. And then finally, you've got the danger of could somebody use a weapon comprised of ones and zeros to create physical destruction in infrastructure? And no need to comment on who may or may not have done it, but somebody used a cyber weapon to destroy the critical infrastructure of Iran with the Stuxnet virus that caused 1,000 centrifuges at Natanz to destroy themselves. So this is not science fiction anymore. It's real.
So the greatest, divulging of U.S. secrets in history occurred as a result of two fellows, both of whom had security clearance. They'd gone through the proctological exam of, having everybody they know checked out, and, and they basically walked out the door with the secrets. How does that happen? And then can we prevent it from happening again?
Yeah, remember that power down thing in that first point? American Army has said stupid PFC since Valley Forge. None have been so empowered as Bradley Manning. Mm-hmm. Okay, so remember, the ability to do good or to do ill has been incredibly magnified and multiplied by these new tools. And so you have Manning doing what he did. You had Snowden doing what he did.
And he walked out the door, as I understand it, with basically a flash drive, or something like that.
Yeah, no, exactly. Manning had a CD that he labeled Lady Gaga.
Got it.
And Manning is, Snowden's doing it on thumb drives and uploading it at home on his computer. And so this is called a counterintelligence threat by folks in government. So this counterintelligence threat is much, much more severe than it ever has been in the past, particularly from the trusted insider who's been so empowered by all the tools. Now, so that's one reality. Second reality is after 9/11, you and your elected representatives quite fairly criticized my old community for not sharing information enough. How come you're keeping it in stovepipes? How come you're not making it more generally accessible? Okay, I got it. We'll make sure most everything is accessible to most everybody. And we did. No doubt overachieved. There are better ways of doing it. But fundamentally though, this is a permanent condition. We are not going to be able to box this stuff up with a very incredibly narrowly defined need-to-know principle. Otherwise, we won't be nearly as good as you need us to be to defend us against, remember, The threats coming in this direction, which are much more granular and much more detailed than checking on Soviet intercontinental ballistic missiles in Siberia. So you've got to, so I mean, you have two unavoidable realities. Three, one, technology enables. Two, you got to share information far more rapidly than you've ever done before. And then number three, back to the tectonics, we've got a political culture, an American culture now, particularly among the young, that makes far less of a distinction between secret and not secret than you and I grew up with. And so this is a permanent condition. Will this happen again? Yes. All right? Yes.
But these were people who essentially walked out. I mean, it wasn't the Chinese, it wasn't the Russians, it wasn't the
Probably
Iranians.
Not.
As far
Probably.
as
I keep an open mind on Snowden, but
all right, fair enough. But I mean, it seems like they were sort of missionaries, as you point out, on this sort of privacy issue, and it seems like maybe what you're saying is that you can't, because you talk about counterintelligence being so important, but counterintelligence seems to be facing foreign threats, and counterintelligence in this case.
You talked about that proctological exercise we put everyone through before they get access to secrets, right? Mm-hmm. And by the way, it consumes incredible resources, and we're probably doing it wrong. All right? I mean, seriously, we are. Part of the questions you get are, so, would you ever go to Cuba? I mean, which kind of was an interesting question 50 years ago, but not nearly as important now. What we're probably going to end up with is a system where those people entrusted with your secrets, with the nation's secrets, are going to be subjected to an incredibly invasive regime of constant oversight. Not you get checked at the door with a very deep background investigation, then you're good to go for 5 years. All right? It's going to mean at least a government metadata awareness of where you surf on the web, what your bank accounts, all of your assets look like. I mean, this is incredibly invasive, but we're probably going to do that and move from this get through the gate, you're good to go, to a system of invasive, continuous monitoring. And frankly, that makes me uncomfortable. If it's a necessity, it's a necessity, but it flies in the face, I think, of who we view ourselves to be.
So I don't know if this falls within your area of expertise, but I mean, given everything you know about cybersecurity and the failures, what do you think is the likelihood that most people in this room's computers have been, somehow tapped, invaded?
Sure. 100%.
100%.
Yeah. No, look, I work for the Chertoff group. We occasionally have companies come to us and say, we just got a call from the FBI, or more often than not, another guy in our sector got a call from the FBI. We want to engage you guys. First of all, we want you guys to kind of look at our network and determine whether or not we have been penetrated, right? And we kind of say, you've been penetrated. Here's our card, send the check here. Remember I quickly went through threat intelligence and vulnerability and consequence management, as things you do. Most of your work to protect your companies has been in what we call V, vulnerability protection. It's McAfee, some other firewall, some shrink wrap product, cyber hygiene, good passwords, and so on. The people who do this really well tell me that if you do that perfectly, and none of us do, but if you do that perfectly, you will secure yourself against the least competent 80% of the cyber danger, which means the other 20%, if they want in, are in. And that's why the growing field here now is consequence management. And now, it's hard to work on your home computer, but for a large firm, it's how do you operate while penetrated? How do you survive while under attack? How do you recognize that you have been penetrated? How do you protect your more precious data more tightly than your less precious information? How do you identify the attacker? How do you rid yourself of the attacker? Most of the private sector energy I was referring to is now in that factor, consequence management, not stopping them at the firewall. Keep doing that, that's okay. Get rid of the nuisance guys. But it's now consequence management.
And so what does that mean? We shouldn't put our data on our computer? And how do we manage this?
Yeah, first of all, make yourself a harder target than the next guy. All right, it's like that Far Side cartoon with the, with two bears, and the crosshairs are on one bear. And make yourself a harder target than the average, and people who want to steal your data will just go like water along the path of least resistance. And so that's the first thing you ought to do. But you're also right. If you're putting it in ones and zeros, there is tremendous risk that it is no longer yours and no longer private. So you just have to really be aware of that.
So what's the likelihood that the Obamacare website has been hacked? I mean, our private data that's sort of HIPAA compliant. And
if not now, it's inevitable that it will be. Now, can we make that harder? Can we identify it quickly? Can we wrap the most precious private information you have more tightly than your address? Sure. I mean, there are things to be done. But my fear is this was done so quickly that it's going to be vulnerable for a while until it's cleaned up.
So we need to expect not to have our privacy for some period of time. You're saying we can harden our target, as best we can, but it's basically ineffective.
Look, here's the great unfairness, all right? So I told you what the cyber sins are: stealing your stuff, messing with your network, or creating physical damage. Who are the sinners? Nation states, criminal gangs, and activists. And nation states are most capable, and then criminal gangs, and activists, thank God, all right? Because I don't know what motivates or satisfies this group down here. The great unfairness, the very revealing dimension of this cyber conflict right now is that we have nation states, China, okay, with all the resources of a nation state, going after American companies, which are not nation states, as big as they might be. They're down here in this range. Now look, China goes after General Dynamics, Northrop Grumman, Boeing, and steals the plans for the F-35. Game on. That's acceptable international practice. That's spying. Shame on us. But when China, the nation state, goes after small and mid-sized or non-defense American firms, that's an incredibly uneven playing field. All right? And so firms are going to have to up their game, make themselves tougher targets. But
so I've been told that there's infrastructure in China, I think I've read an article about this, that we've identified, or somebody's identified, that where it is, in fact, a Chinese government run facility of thousands of people who are simply directed not only at U.S. defense cyber assets, but also companies and even individuals. Is that true?
The guy who published it was Kevin Mandia, CEO of Mandia Corporation. Issued a white paper about a year ago now. Wonderful research, pointed out a Chinese People's Liberation Army facility in Shanghai from which most of this is done. Look, I've sat across the table from the head of PLA3, which is their cyber guys, all right? I mean, they're human beings too, all right? But their view of legitimate foreign intelligence is a much more expansive view than the United States. We steal stuff to keep you free and keep you safe. We do not steal stuff to make you rich. The Chinese make them rich inside their definition of state-sponsored espionage. And so they go after things that we would never consider to be a legitimate foreign intelligence target.
Our time is up, but I'm going to ask one last question, taking the interviewer's privilege. How real is Homeland?
Love Homeland. Love it. It's been a great year, cinematography-wise, for the national intelligence structure. Homeland, Zero Dark 30. There was a HBO special, Manhunt, on the hunt for bin Laden. More or less showed the intelligence community in a positive light. Homeland has got everything in the foreground wrong. Okay? You use a cell phone in CIA headquarters, somebody's pulling a sidearm on you. All right? But all the background is good. The focus, almost the obsession, the continuous commitment to mission, the camaraderie of the folks who are kind of a little bit out of the mainstream of culture, American culture, at least with regard to what they're doing. I got asked this question in Santa Fe a year and a half ago. And George Tenet, one of my predecessors, was in the room. And Jeff Bezos' schmooze. And I got asked, so what about Homeland? Yeah. And then I said, by the way, I know Kerry. And he said, really? I said, well, not Claire Danes, but I know an officer, minus the sex, the drugs, and the bipolar thing, is Kerry. And I got all done, and I walked down and met my wife, Janine, and Stephanie Tennant and George were there. And George kind of walks up to me, leans into me, and says her name in my ear. I like Homeland.
Thank you very much.
Great job. On behalf of the Economic Club of Chicago, thank you to General Hayden and J.B. Pritzker for a terrific conversation. And thank you all for coming. This meeting is adjourned.
Thank you.